Part 1. The Bride, who arrived too late. The train didn't so much stop at Red Hollow as it gave up on it. The engine wheezed and groaned to a halt, the way an old man lowers himself into a chair. Slow, reluctant, with something like defeat in the motion. Steam rolled across the platform in thick gray sheets, and when it cleared, there was nothing remarkable waiting on the other side. Just a weathered sign. A half-collapsed water tower. Two men in dusty hats who glanced up, registered that the passenger car had someone in it, and looked back down at whatever they'd been watching before. Clara Hawthorne stood at the top of the iron steps with her suitcase in one hand and the letter in the other. She'd read it so many times the fold creases had gone soft, and the ink had smudged along the bottom edge where she kept pressing her thumb. A man of honest character and modest means, the agency had written. Silas Mercer of Red Hollow. Widowed. 5 years ranching. 7 children, various ages. Seeks a capable woman for partnership in family life on the frontier. Partnership. That was the word she'd come back to again and again on the 9-day journey west. Not romance. Not love. Not even the pretense of it. Just partnership. Something practical. Something real. She'd told herself she could live with that. She stepped down onto the platform, and the heel of her left boot caught a loose board, and she stumbled, grabbing the iron rail just in time to keep from pitching forward. Her suitcase hit the platform with a heavy thud. A cat watching from beneath a bench didn't even flinch. "You the woman from back east?" The voice was small. She turned. He was maybe 10 years old, with bare feet gray from dust and dark eyes that looked like they'd seen things boys his age had no business seeing. He wore a shirt 2 sizes too big. A man's shirt, the cuffs rolled up past his elbows. And his hair had been cut by someone with no particular skill or patience. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it around and around by the brim. "I'm Eli," he said. "Eli Mercer." The name landed on her like cold water. She looked past him automatically, some old reflex. "Where's your father?" And then stopped herself because the boy's face said everything before his mouth did. There was a particular kind of stillness that children learn when something terrible has already happened and they've had time to stop crying about it. Eli Mercer had that stillness. "How long?" Clara asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. 6 weeks and 2 days. He said it the way children count time, precisely, without sentiment. "The horse came down on him. It was fast, is what Mr. Poole said. He didn't suffer long." He paused. "I don't know if that's true. Mr. Poole says things to make people feel better." Clara set her suitcase down, not because she needed to, but because she needed to do something with her hands that wasn't shaking. She'd come 2,000 miles. She'd packed every practical thing she owned. She'd said goodbye to a sister who didn't understand, a landlady who thought she'd lost her mind, and a city that had been quietly suffocating her for 4 years. She'd built 9 days of rattling, sleepless train travel into something she could endure by telling herself, "When you get there, it will all make sense." "Is there someone I should speak to?" she said. "About arrangements. A ticket back east." Eli looked at her feet. He looked at her suitcase. He looked somewhere to the left of her, past the end of the platform, out toward the ridge that rose brown and sharp against the pale morning sky. "I've got 6 brothers and sisters back at the ranch," he said. "June's the oldest after me. She's been trying to keep things going, but she's 15, and the younger ones—" He stopped, cleared his throat, started over. "Nobody's come to help. I mean, some people from town brought food at the start, but that stopped. And the animals still need feeding, and He stopped again, pressed his lips together. "I came to get you because I didn't know what else to do. June told me not to. She said you'd just leave." He finally looked up at her directly. "Are you going to leave?" Clara Hawthorne stood on the platform of Red Hollow Station with a dead man's letter in her hand and a barefoot boy waiting for an answer, and every sensible thought she had said the same thing clearly: "Get back on the train." She picked up her suitcase. "Take me to where you left the wagon," she said. The ride out to the Mercer Ranch took the better part of an hour, much of it in silence. Eli drove with the focused attention of someone who'd learned the task out of necessity rather than desire. His hands competent on the reins, his eyes on the trail, his mouth closed. The land around them was the kind of beautiful that didn't ask for your opinion, wide and hard and indifferent, with yellow grass stretching toward hills that kept their distance no matter how long you traveled toward them. Clara kept her suitcase balanced across her knees. She watched the landscape and thought about practicalities because it was easier than thinking about anything else. She had $11.30. She had a return letter she could write that might produce a small sum from the agency, a sympathy fund, they'd mentioned, for circumstances beyond the bride's control. She had a working knowledge of two things: how to keep books for a dry goods store, which she had done for 3 years, and how to keep a household running on almost nothing, which she'd done for considerably longer. What she did not have was any earthly idea what she was doing. "What's the youngest?" she asked. "May. She's 3. Eli kept his eyes on the trail. "She doesn't remember our mother. She was barely walking when, well, and now with Papa." He clicked to the horse, which had started to slow. "She cries a lot at night. June's got her sleeping in the same bed, but June doesn't sleep much herself." "And the others?" He listed them without being asked, which told her he'd been thinking about them the whole ride. Thomas, 7, who'd gone quiet and strange. The twins, Daniel and Ruth, 9 years old, who'd picked a fight with the pool boys in town and weren't allowed back. Harriet, 12, who'd stopped eating properly. And then June, 15 and running a collapsing ranch with no help and too much pride to ask for what she didn't have. "June doesn't want you here," Eli said. "Not unkindly, just factually. I know. She thinks you'll stay a week, maybe 2, and then leave when things get hard. She says mail-order brides aren't. She said some things that weren't very charitable." "I imagine she did." He glanced at her sideways. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He thought about it seriously, the way children do when they decide an adult has asked a real question. "Someone softer," he said finally, "or someone harder. I'm not sure which. Someone that was more, decided, like they already knew what they were going to do." "I don't know what I'm going to do," Clara said honestly. He seemed to find this reassuring rather than alarming. He nodded once and turned back to the trail. The ranch came into view around a bend where 2 hills met like shoulders pressed together. Clara's first thought was that the paintings she'd seen of frontier homesteads had been optimistic. The cabin was low and long, with a roof that sagged on the left side and a chimney that leaned like a man who'd had too much to drink. The fence posts around the yard were standing mostly from habit. The barn had been repaired in 4 or 5 different places with 4 or 5 different kinds of wood, none of them matching. But smoke was rising from the chimney, thin and stubborn, but rising. A girl appeared in the doorway before the wagon stopped. June Mercer was 15 years old and built like someone who'd had to be. She had her father's dark coloring and her mother's mouth. Clara wouldn't know that until much later when she saw the one photograph. And she was looking at Clara the way you look at a problem that's arrived ahead of schedule. "I told you not to bring her," she said to Eli. "I know. So why—" "She didn't have anywhere else to go," Eli said. He climbed down from the wagon. "And neither do we." June looked at her brother for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara, still sitting in the wagon with her suitcase in her lap. "There's no room for you," June said flatly. "The cabin's already crowded and we don't have food to spare." "I can see that," Clara said. "Then why are you here?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the $11, the dead man's letter, the 9 days on the train. She thought about a cat that hadn't flinched when her suitcase hit the platform, and a boy who'd stood barefoot in the dust counting weeks and days with the careful precision of someone who had run out of other ways to measure his grief. "Because your brother came to the station," she said, "and he asked me not to leave." She climbed down from the wagon. "I'm not here to take anything from you, June. I don't have any claim on this place. Your father and I never met. But I can see your chimney is smoking, and you're feeding people every day, and your roof looks like it's going to give way before winter, and I know how to do several useful things." She stood in the dirt with her suitcase and looked at the girl directly. "Tell me what needs doing most and I'll start there. And if in a week you want me gone, I'll go." June stared at her. Something moved behind her eyes. Not warmth, not trust, not anything so simple. More like a calculation. The kind you make when you're 15 and exhausted and you've been refusing help long enough that refusing it has started to feel more like stubbornness than survival. "The back fence is down," she said finally. "Something's been getting at the chickens." "All right, And the water barrel in the kitchen has a split in the side. I can look at that. June held the door but didn't open it wider. Not yet. You'll sleep in the main room, there's no privacy, and it gets cold at night and the twins kick. That's fine. There was a long pause. Supper's thin, June said. Don't expect much. I've eaten thin before. Another pause. June looked at her once more, that same hard, measuring look, and then stepped back from the door. It wasn't welcome. It wasn't anything close to warm. But it was a door opening, and that was enough. Clara Hawthorne picked up her suitcase and walked into the Mercer house. From the shadows near the fireplace, a small voice said, "Are you our new mama?" It was May. 3 years old, with a smear of something on her chin and enormous, serious eyes. Clara crouched down to her level. "No," she said gently. "I'm Clara. I'm going to stay for a while and help." May thought about this. "Are you good at fixing things?" "Some things," Clara said. "I'm working on the rest." May nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. From the doorway, June watched all of this without expression. Outside, the wind pushed across the ridge and the roof groaned. Somewhere in the barn, a cow shifted and lowed and went quiet again. The smoke from the chimney bent sideways in the gusts and kept rising. And Clara Hawthorne, who had come to Red Hollow to be someone's wife, started looking around the room for a bucket and a rag and something she could actually fix. You said part 2. Lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hối thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 2 lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mọi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc, kể theo ngôi thứ 3. Giữ đồ kịch tính, không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình, viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Sự chi đần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. 1524. We'll show 4. Claude responded, Part 2. A choice no one expected. Part 2. A choice. No one expected. The back fence took 3 hours. Clara had never repaired a fence in her life, but she'd watched Eli do the first post, and after that, it was mostly a matter of paying attention and not quitting when her palms started to bleed. The wire was old and stubborn, and it bit through her gloves, thin city gloves, useless things. She'd throw them out by evening. And the posts had to be driven into ground that had baked hard as brick under the summer sun. Eli worked beside her without much commentary. He handed her things when she needed them and didn't say anything when she did something wrong, just waited until she figured it out herself. By the time they finished, her back hurt in a way she hadn't known backs could hurt, and the light had shifted from white to yellow across the ridge. "That'll hold," Eli said, looking at their work. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a fact. For how long? He thought about it honestly. Through winter, maybe. If nothing pushes against it hard. She looked at the posts, the stretched wire, the imperfect angles. That'll do for now. When they came back to the cabin, June had supper on, a thin soup that was more water than anything else, with pieces of cornbread so dense they sat in the bowl instead of floating. Clara ate her portion without comment and didn't ask for more. Thomas, the 7-year-old who'd gone quiet and strange, sat across from her and watched her eat with the focused attention of someone trying to catch her at something. The twins, Daniel and Ruth, argued in low voices about something that had happened 2 days ago and hadn't been resolved yet. Harriet, 12 and sharp-shouldered, sat at the far end of the table and pushed her food around without eating it. May climbed onto the bench next to Claire without asking and pressed her small, warm weight against Claire's side. June, serving from the pot, noticed but didn't say anything. After supper, while the younger children were being sorted towards sleep, a process that involved considerably more negotiation than Clara expected, she sat at the table with the water barrel between her knees and a piece of pine she'd found in the barn. The split in the barrel was along the bottom seam, which was the worst place for it. A proper repair needed a cooper's tools she didn't have. What she had was pine pitch she'd found in a tin on the shelf, and the particular kind of stubbornness that comes from not having a better option. June came back from settling the little ones and stopped in the doorway between the sleeping room and the main room. She looked at Clara and the barrel. "That won't work," she said. "Probably not permanently, but it'll slow the leak until we can get it looked at properly. We don't have money for a cooper." "I know that." June sat down across the table, not because she wanted to be near Clara, but because the chair was there and she'd been on her feet since before dawn. She pulled her hair back and held it there, her elbow on the table, staring at nothing in particular. "The money ran out in the first 2 weeks," she said. It wasn't an invitation to conversation. It was more like something she needed to say out loud, to someone, even someone she didn't entirely trust yet. "Papa had some put by, not much, but some. Enough for a month or two if we were careful. But then there were debts we didn't know about. A man named Galt came with papers, said Papa owed him for grain and lumber, and I don't know what else. I couldn't read all of it." She stopped. "I read some of it. Some of it I couldn't make out." Clara kept working on the barrel. "How much did Galt say was owed?" "More than Papa had. More than the ranch earns in a year." She dropped her hand and looked at Clara directly. "Do you know anything about debts? Contracts?" "Some. I kept books for a store in Ohio for 3 years. I'm not a lawyer." "Nobody here is a lawyer. The nearest one is 40 miles. Clara set the pine pitch down and looked at her. "Do you still have the papers Galt brought?" Something moved across June's face. A calculation, the same kind Clara had seen in the doorway that afternoon. "Why?" "Because I'd like to read them." "Why?" "Because men like Galt don't always bring accurate papers." She picked the pitch back up. "Do you have them or not?" June was quiet for a moment. Then she got up, went to the wooden box on the shelf beside the fireplace, the kind of box every frontier family had, where important papers went to be kept and often forgotten, and came back with a folded document. She set it on the table, not toward Clara, exactly, just on the table. Clara looked at it, didn't touch it yet. "Can I?" June sat back down and didn't say no. The document was 2 pages, written in the cramped hand of someone who knew what they were doing with language, which was itself a kind of warning. Clara read through it slowly, going back over sections that moved too quickly. It listed 4 separate debts attributed to Silas Mercer: grain from the season prior, lumber for repairs, a feed loan from the previous winter, and a 4th item described only as outstanding balance per verbal agreement of March, settlement due upon demand. That last one. That was the one. "This verbal agreement," Clara said. "Did your father ever mention a debt to Galt from March?" June frowned. "Papa talked about Galt once. Said he'd borrowed some feed over the winter." She paused. "He said he'd paid it back by spring." "Did he say that to anyone else? Anyone who might remember?" "Old Hector at the mill. They talked most mornings." She looked at the paper. "What does it mean? It might mean nothing, or it might mean that Galt took a paid debt and put it back on the account." Clara refolded the document carefully. "I want to talk to Hector." "You want to go into town," June said flatly, "after being here one day." "I want to go into town to talk to someone who might help you keep this ranch." Clara looked at her. "That's a different thing." June looked at her for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up again. The left side of the roof, the side that sagged, made a sound like a slow exhale. "Fine," June said. Not warmly, not gratefully, just fine, which was all it needed to be. Clara put the papers in her own bag, beside the letter she'd carried 2,000 miles. She didn't sleep well that night. The main room was cold in the way old cabins get cold. Drafts that found every gap in the walls and floor moving like something with purpose. May ended up beside her sometime after midnight, small and radiating heat, having migrated from June's bed without anyone noticing. Daniel, or possibly Ruth, she still couldn't tell them apart in the dark, kicked the wall twice and then was quiet. The roof settled. The fire went low. Clara lay in the dark and listened to 7 children breathing and told herself she would decide in the morning what she was actually doing here. She told herself that every night for the next 2 weeks, and every morning she got up and started the day before she'd finished deciding. Red Hollow, as a town, had formed the way a lot of frontier towns formed, out of proximity and need rather than any particular plan. A trading post had been there first, then a mill, then a handful of structures that called themselves businesses without excessive ambition. The single main street had a bank that kept odd hours, a general store with a porch where old men sat in the afternoons, a blacksmith, and a building that served as a meeting hall during the week and for other purposes on weekends. The whole thing looked like it was waiting to see whether it would grow into something or dry up and blow east. Clara drove the wagon in on a Tuesday with Eli beside her because she didn't know where the mill was. The town watched her with the low-level curiosity of places where strangers were infrequent enough to be noticed, but not unusual enough to be exciting. The mill sat at the north end of town where the creek ran through, and Hector Blaine was exactly where June said he'd be, standing outside with a mug of something, watching the water wheel turn with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found the one thing in his life that didn't disappoint him. He was 60 or so, with a white beard and hands like slabs of cured wood. "You're the Mercer girls." He stopped, recalibrated. "You're the woman from back east, the one who stayed. Clara Hawthorne." He looked at her the way you look at something you've heard conflicting reports about. "Heard you showed up and didn't leave." "That's accurate. What do you want?" She liked that he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I want to know if Silas Mercer ever mentioned a debt to Galt. A feed loan from last winter. He told his daughter he'd paid it back." Hector's expression shifted. Nothing dramatic, just the slight tightening of a man who knows something and is deciding how much of it belongs to him. "Silas paid Galt back in February," he said. "I was standing right there, counted the money myself because Silas's eyes weren't good in low light, and he asked me to." "Would you put that in writing?" Hector looked at her over the rim of his mug. "What is Galt claiming?" "That the debt is still outstanding. Outstanding balance per verbal agreement, his paper says. Part of a larger debt against the estate." Hector lowered the mug. He was quiet for long enough that Clara thought he was going to say no. Then he said, "That son of a—" and stopped himself because Eli was standing 6 feet away. "Yes," he said instead. "I'll put it in writing. You got paper?" She had paper. He wrote it out himself, slowly and carefully, in handwriting that was better than she expected. She folded it and put it with the debt papers in her bag. "He's not going to like this," Hector said, handing the pen back. "I know. Galt's connected to Talbot. You know who Talbot is?" She didn't. She looked at Eli. Eli's jaw tightened slightly, which was the most emotion she'd seen from him about anything that wasn't one of the younger children. "Vern Talbot owns the cattle operation on the eastern side of the valley. He's been—" He stopped, chose his words. "He's been interested in the ridgeland for a while. Papa never sold. They argued about it more than once." Hector made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Interested is a polite word for it. Talbot's been after that water source on the Mercer Ridge for 2 years. There's a spring up there that runs year-round. Valley gets dry enough in August, that spring is worth more than the land around it." He looked at Clara. Silas dying was convenient for some people. The word convenient sat in the air between them like something with weight. "Was there any question about the accident?" Clara asked carefully. Hector looked at her sharply. Then he looked away, at the water wheel. "No question the horse came down on him. That part's sure." He paused. Whether the horse was startled on purpose, that nobody looked at too hard. Silas was a difficult man to like if you were in his way. Not a difficult man to like if you weren't. He finished his coffee. "Be careful, Miss Hawthorne. I mean that plainly." She meant to ask more, but a shadow fell across the ground beside her, and she turned to find a man standing at the edge of the mill yard who hadn't been there a moment before. He was wide through the chest, with a face that had clearly been handsome once and had since decided to become something more intimidating. He wore the kind of coat that said money without advertising it. Didn't know Silas had company coming, the man said. He was looking at Clara with an expression of polite curiosity that wasn't particularly polite. Hector's posture changed. Not obvious, but Clara caught it. A slight stillness. Vern, Hector said. So this was Talbot. I'm Clara Hawthorne, she said. She didn't offer her hand. Talbot, Vern Talbot. He looked at her the way men look at women they've assessed and categorized in the first 3 seconds and are now verifying their conclusion. You're the one staying at the Mercer place. I am. How are those children managing? He asked, and he said it with what sounded like genuine concern, which made it worse somehow. They're managing, Clara said. Terrible situation. Silas was... He shook his head. Well, he wasn't always easy to work with, but nobody deserves to go the way he did. He paused. I've actually been meaning to ride out to the ranch. There's some business to settle now that the estate question is being sorted. Water rights, mainly. Silas and I had a long-running disagreement about the spring on the North Ridge. I think with cooler heads we can work something out that's fair to everyone. I'd be happy to hear your proposal, Clara said pleasantly. When you come out, bring your documentation. Something shifted in Talbot's expression. Not anger. Something more controlled than anger, more like a slight recalibration. Of course, he said. Always proper to do it right. He touched the brim of his hat. Miss Hawthorne? Hector. He walked away without hurrying. Eli waited until he was out of earshot. You shouldn't have said that. Why not? Because now he knows you know things need to be documented. He looked at her with his old, careful eyes. He'll move faster. Clara watched Talbot disappear around the corner of the trading post. The comfortable, unhurried way he moved. The walk of a man who's been the largest thing in every room he's entered for so long that rooms have started to reshape themselves around him. I know, she said. That's why I said it. Mwah. The following days had a brutal arithmetic to them. Feed for the animals cost money they barely had. 2 of the chickens died. 1 from whatever had been getting through the fence before Clara fixed it, and 1 from something internal that Eli said sometimes just happened and there was nothing to be done. The sagging section of roof, when Clara finally climbed up to look at it properly, turned out to be worse than it looked from the ground. 3 of the primary support beams had rotted where the old roof had leaked, and the whole left section would need to come down and be rebuilt before the first heavy snow, or they'd lose it entirely. She told June this while they stood in the yard looking up at it. June's expression didn't change much, but her voice when she spoke was tired in the particular way that goes past regular exhaustion into something more structural. We don't have the timber. Not yet. Or the money for timber. Not yet. June looked at her. Do you always talk like that? Like what? Like everything is temporary, like it's all just not yet. Clara thought about it honestly. It's either that or it's permanent, she said, and permanent doesn't help us fix the roof. June made a sound that was almost a short laugh. Not warm, but it was there. Thomas has been eating better, she said, apparently to the roof. Since you got here. I don't know why. He sits next to me at supper, Clara said. I think he's watching to see if I eat the cornbread without complaining. It's terrible cornbread. It really is. Another almost laugh. June crossed her arms and kept her eyes on the roofline. Harriet says you helped her with her letters yesterday. She asked me to. She doesn't ask people for things, usually. I know. Clara looked at the roof, too. She's very smart. Her reading's good. It's the numbers she doesn't like. Papa never thought numbers were important for girls. Papa was wrong about that. A pause. A long one. Then, yeah? June said quietly. He was wrong about some things. She said it without malice and without excessive feeling, just the particular honesty of someone who loved someone complicated and is still figuring out how to carry that. Clara didn't say anything. Some moments don't need filling. They stood there a while longer, the 2 of them, looking at a roof that needed rebuilding and figuring up what they had and what they didn't, which was a way of saying they were planning even when it didn't feel like it. The wind came off the ridge and pushed through the yard, and the flag of smoke from the chimney leaned sideways, and the cattle in the far field moved their heavy heads, and the whole ranch groaned on under the weight of its own existence, as it had been doing for years, as it would keep doing because they would keep asking it to, Inside, May was singing something tuneless and loud. Ruth was telling her to stop. Daniel was agreeing with May. Thomas was probably watching the door. June unfolded her arms. "I'll go start supper," she said, not warmly, just as a statement of fact, of intention. "I'll bring in water," Clara said. And that was that. Not friendship yet. Not trust. Entirely. But something functional growing between them, like the fence posts in the hard ground. Not elegant. Not even comfortable, but holding. Clara picked up the bucket by the well and lowered it into the dark water and pulled it back full and heavy. And when she stood up, she could see, just at the edge of the ridge where the land bent away from the setting sun, a single rider watching the property from a distance. He was too far to recognize. He sat very still. She watched him for a while, and he watched her, and then he turned his horse and rode east, back toward the valley, back toward the flat land where Talbot's operation spread out like something that had always been there, that expected to stay. Clara carried the water into the house. She didn't say anything to June about the rider. Not that night. But she went to her bag before she slept and checked that Hector's letter was still there, and the debt papers. And she lay in the dark listening to the roof settle and the children breathe, and she thought about the word Hector had used, convenient. She thought about it for a long time. You said, Part 3, Louis, viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 3, Louis, viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc, kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả quá mướt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ đành bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. 1528, Claude responded. Part 3, The War for the Ridge. Part 3, The War for the Ridge, Galt came on a Thursday. Clara knew he was coming before she saw him because the dogs, two half-wild things that lived under the barn and didn't acknowledge anyone's authority, started making noise in a way they didn't make for neighbors or passing travelers. A lower, more serious sound. She was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard it, and she set the axe down and waited. He rode in with another man. The second man was younger, with a flat face and the particular kind of stillness that isn't calm. The stillness of someone paid to stand near trouble and not react until told to. He stopped at the fence line and stayed on his horse. Galt came through the gate. He was thinner than Clara had expected, narrow through the shoulders, with a neat dark beard and the careful clothes of a man who wanted to be mistaken for legitimate. He looked at the yard, the cabin, the repaired fence, the axe in the dirt, and then he looked at Clara. "Mrs. Mercer?" he said. "Miss Hawthorne," she said. "I'm not Mrs. Mercer." Something moved behind his eyes. He'd done his homework then. He knew who she was. "Of course, I was told, well, you're the woman looking after the property. I'm staying here with the children, yes. I've come about the estate debt." He reached into his coat and produced a document. Same cramped handwriting, same format as the papers June had shown her. "I've been patient, Miss Hawthorne, given the circumstances, but the account is overdue and I need to discuss a settlement." Clara didn't take this paper. "I've read the account you gave the family already. I have some questions about one item." Galt's expression stayed pleasant. Men like Galt were very good at staying pleasant. "I'd be happy to address any confusion. The verbal agreement for March, the outstanding balance, She looked at him without any particular expression. Silas Mercer paid that debt in February. I have a signed witness statement from someone who counted the money. The pleasant expression held for 2 more seconds than it should have. That was the tell. I'm not sure which amount you're referring to, he said. There were multiple transactions. There was one feed loan from last winter, Clara said. It was paid back in February. Hector Blaine witnessed the payment. He's written that down and signed it. She tilted her head slightly. Would you like me to get you a copy? Galt looked at her. He looked at the cabin behind her. He looked at the man still waiting at the fence. There may have been a recording error, he said finally. His voice had gone flat. The pleasant had left it. These things happen when accounts are managed across multiple... Yes, Clara said. They do happen. Sometimes they happen accidentally, and sometimes they don't. She held his gaze. If you'd like to sit down and go through the remaining items on the account together, I'm available to do that. If any of the other debts are legitimate, we'll work out a payment arrangement. If they're not... She left the end of the sentence where it was. Galt looked at her for a long moment with the look of a man doing rapid arithmetic. Then he took his paper back, folded it, and put it in his coat. I'll be in touch, he said. I'll be here, Clara said. He went back through the gate without another word. She heard the 2 horses leave at a pace that was controlled but not slow. She picked up the axe and went back to splitting kindling, and her hands were steady, which surprised her a little. June appeared in the cabin doorway. She'd been listening from inside. Clara had known she was there, had heard the particular quality of the silence behind the door. He'll go to Talbot, June said. I know. And then what? Clara set the axe and looked at the ridge, the line of it against the sky. Up there, somewhere in the north fold, where the land bent back on itself, was the spring that ran year-round. She hadn't seen it yet. She needed to. Then we need to be ready, she said. Ready for what, exactly? I don't know yet. That's what concerns me. She found the spring on a Saturday with Eli as a guide, in the hour after the younger children had been set to their morning tasks. They climbed the ridge on foot because the trail was too narrow and too rough for the horse, switchbacking up through dry grass and loose shale until the land leveled out in a wide natural shelf, and there it was. It wasn't dramatic. Springs rarely were. A place where the earth just opened quietly and let water come through. It pooled in a natural depression lined with dark, smooth rock, and then ran off east in a thin, constant thread that disappeared into the hillside further down. But the water was clear and cold, even in the heat of late summer, and when Clara cupped her hand and tasted it, it was clean all the way down. Papa used to bring us up here when we were small, Eli said. He was standing at the edge of the pool, looking at the water. Before Mama died, it was something he did. Every spring, first warm day. Clara didn't say anything. Talbot offered him money for it, twice. He picked up a flat stone and didn't throw it, just held it. Papa said the spring was what kept the ranch viable in dry years. Said if he sold the water rights and then had a bad drought, we'd be done. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things, just... Eli stopped, set the stone down. Not about everything. They stood there a moment in the ordinary difficulty of honoring someone complicated. We need to find out what documentation Talbot actually has, Clara said. He mentioned water rights. If he filed any kind of claim, it would be registered. 40 miles to the county seat. I know. She looked at the thread of water running east. Eli, if Talbot got the water rights, what happens to the ranch? He didn't answer right away. August and September, we'd be fine. There's still some flow in the creek. But October through April, he shook his head. We'd be hauling water from town every week. We couldn't sustain the animals. We couldn't sustain ourselves. He looked at her. We'd lose the ranch. Not immediately, but within a year. That was what Talbot was counting on. Not a fight. A slow unwinding. Clara looked at the spring, the clear water moving with that quiet indifference that water has always had toward the trouble of the people who need it. All right, she said. We need a lawyer. We have $11, Eli said. I know, I'm working on that too. What she was working on, specifically, was a letter she'd been drafting for 4 days to the Founders Trust, a land protection organization she'd read about in a newspaper someone had left on the train. They worked with frontier homestead families on legal disputes. She wasn't entirely certain they covered this territory. She wasn't entirely certain they'd respond, and she wasn't entirely certain any of it would come together in time. But the letter was the best option she had. So she worked on it in the evenings after the children were settled, sitting close to the fire because the lamp oil was running low, writing and crossing out and writing again. Harriet found her at it one night. "What are you writing?" She'd come out for water and then not left, standing in the dim room in her nightgown with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, watching Clara scratch out another sentence. A letter asking for legal help. Harriet came and stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. She was quiet for a while. "You've spelled encumbrance wrong," she said. Clara looked at it. She had. "Thank you." Harriet sat down across from her. She had the same dark eyes as Eli, but where Eli's were watchful and restrained, Harriet's moved quickly over everything. She was 12 years old and took in information the way a fire takes in air, constantly, in all directions. "Is someone trying to take the ranch?" she asked. Clara looked at her and made a decision. Harriet wasn't 6. She wasn't May. "Someone is trying to take the water rights on the North Ridge. Without the spring, the ranch becomes very difficult to hold." Harriet absorbed this without visible alarm. "Who?" "A man named Talbot." "I know who he is. He came here once when Papa was alive. Papa made us go inside." She paused. "Papa was angry for 2 days after." "Do you know what they talked about?" "No, but—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "Before Papa died, maybe 2 weeks before, I heard him and Eli talking late. I wasn't supposed to be awake." She glanced up. "He was going to write something down. Something about the ranch, about what would happen if something happened to him. He said he had papers drawn up in town and he was going to add to them." Clara went very still. "Do you know what papers? Where they were?" "No." Harriet frowned. "But he went into town the week before he died. Eli drove him. I remember because he was gone most of the day and he came back different. Quieter, I mean, like he'd decided something." Clara looked at the letter in front of her and then past it. The wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace, the one June had kept the debt papers in. She'd looked through it once, briefly. Papers, a few letters, some old receipts. She hadn't looked carefully enough. She waited until Harriet went back to bed. Then she took the box down, brought it to the table, and went through everything in it, slowly this time. Every piece of paper, unfolded completely, read in full. The letter was at the bottom, folded inside an old envelope that had someone else's name on the front, used stationery, the way a man does when he's careful with things and doesn't want to waste. Inside, in handwriting she didn't recognize, careful, deliberate, clearly written by someone with legal training, was a document 2 pages long. She read it once, read it again, sat back. Silas Mercer, in the last week of his life, had gone to Red Hollow's one lawyer, a man named Aldous Prentice, who apparently worked out of the back of the surveyor's office, and had a guardianship and property document drawn up. It named Clara Hawthorne, his intended, as legal guardian of the 7 Mercer children in the event of his death before the marriage. It also specified that as guardian, she had provisional stewardship of the ranch property until the children reached majority, with the explicit clause that no portion of the property, including water rights, could be transferred, sold, or encumbered without the consent of all living adult guardians. She was the guardian. Had been, legally, since before she stepped off the train. Her name was in the document. Her full name, correctly spelled, with the agency reference number from the original correspondence. He'd put her name in it before they'd even met. She sat with that for a while. The fire had gone low, and the room was cold, and she sat in the half-dark with the paper in her hands thinking about a man she'd never met who had worried enough about his children to plan for his own absence, who had, in some practical and unsentimental frontier way, chosen to trust her before he'd had any reason to. It wasn't comfortable. It felt like obligation, which it was. It also felt like something that had been handed to her with both hands, by someone who'd had no other way to ask. She folded the document and put it with Hector's letter and the debt papers and the founder's trust draft, and her bag was getting heavy with things that mattered, and she went to sleep. In the morning, she told Eli. They were outside before the others woke, the way they'd fallen into doing. Mornings were when they talked plainly, before the day got complicated. She told him about the document, what it said, what it meant. She watched his face while she talked. He didn't cry. He was 10 years old and had apparently made an internal decision some months ago to defer that to a later time. But something moved through him. She saw it in the set of his jaw, in the way he looked away toward the ridge. "He went that week," Eli said. "I drove him. He told me it was surveying business, that he needed to check the property lines. He was quiet. He lied to me." "He protected you," Clara said. "He didn't want you to think he was scared." "He was scared?" She thought about a man going to a lawyer to write a document naming a woman he'd never met as guardian of his 7 children. About what it takes to do that. About what you have to believe about your own situation to take that step. "I think he was worried," she said carefully. "I think he was a man who paid attention to the things happening around him, and he was worried, and he wanted the children to have someone." Eli thought about this, looked at his hands. "Does June know?" "Not yet. She's not going to—" He stopped. "It's going to be hard for her, being told that Papa made a decision about us without telling her." "I know. She's going to say she doesn't need a guardian." "I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "What are you going to say to her?" Clara thought about June, 15 years old, running a falling ranch, refusing help with both hands while quietly, desperately needing it. About the look on her face the night she'd put Silas's debt papers on the table. About the almost laugh over terrible cornbread. "I'm going to tell her the truth," Clara said. "That the document isn't about whether she can manage. It's about making sure Talbot can't take the water without a fight she has the legal standing to win." Eli nodded slowly. They told June that afternoon in the cabin, with the younger children outside under Harriet's watchful eye. Clara put the document on the table between them, not pushing it forward, not withholding it. Just there. June read it, all of it. She read slowly, which Clara now knew meant she was reading carefully rather than struggling. Her expression while she read was impossible to interpret. When she finished, she put it down and stared at the table and said nothing for a long time. "He didn't tell me," she said finally. Her voice was flat. "No. He made a decision about all of us, and he didn't say a word." "Yes." June's jaw was tight. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something contained and pressurized. "That's so like him," she said. "Do the thing, don't explain it, leave other people to figure out what it meant." She pressed her lips together. Was he protecting us, or was he just doing what he always did, deciding on his own and not trusting anyone else with it? Clara said honestly, "I think he was doing both. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive." June looked at her. "He trusted you enough to name you before he knew you," June said. It wasn't a compliment. It was more like a verdict she was still delivering. "He didn't trust me enough to tell me what he was planning. His own daughter." She pushed the document sideways on the table, not away, just sideways. "What does it actually mean? Practically." "It means Talbot cannot make a legal move against the water rights without going through me," Clara said. "And I won't consent. That doesn't stop him from trying, but it means he has to fight it through the law instead of just—" She paused. "Applying pressure until we collapse." "And the lawyer, Prentice?" "I'm going to see him tomorrow, to register the document properly and make sure it's recorded at the county level. 40 miles. I'll leave early." June looked at the document again. At the name written in it, Clara Hawthorne, in a dead man's lawyer's careful hand. "He must have believed in you," June said. It was a strange thing to say. Her voice was strange when she said it, stripped of the usual armor. A stranger. He believed in a stranger more than— She stopped herself. "June." Clara kept her voice level but not distant. "He believed in you. That's why he set it up this way. He knew you'd fight for this place. He just knew you couldn't fight it alone. Not legally, not against men like Talbot. I know you don't need me," Clara said. "You've been managing fine, better than fine, given everything. But this isn't about what you need, it's about what wins." The word wins landed differently than any comfort would have. June heard it. Her chin came up slightly. "When do you leave?" she said. "Dawn. Take Eli. The East Road has a bad crossing after rain, and he knows the way around it." She stood up. "I'll pack food for the trip." She left the document on the table and went to the kitchen, and Clara heard the sounds of things being moved, preparations being made, and understood this was June's way of agreeing. Talbot came to the ranch himself 3 days after Clara returned from the county seat, where Prentice had registered the document with the kind of satisfaction of a man who didn't often get to register things that might actually matter. She'd been back one day. She'd barely slept. Her back was wrecked from 40 miles of road each way, and the children were loud, and May had pulled Harriet's hair, and Thomas had stopped talking again for reasons unclear, and the left section of the roof had developed an additional lean that she did not have time to address. Talbot rode in with 2 men this time, not one. He came through the gate without asking, which she noted. Clara was at the table when he knocked. She was sitting down, the document in front of her, Hector's letter beside it, and the Founders Trust reply, which had arrived miraculously fast, possibly because the organization's regional representative happened to be 3 towns west, open and flat on the other side. She'd arranged them deliberately, not to intimidate, to have them ready. She called through the door, "Come in." Talbot came in, read the room in 2 seconds. Clara seated, papers visible, expression composed, and adjusted his approach so fast she almost missed it. Almost. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "I was hoping we could finally sit down properly." "Please," she said, and gestured at the chair across from her. Not warmly. The way you gesture at a chair when you're the one who lives there. He sat. His men stayed outside, which meant he'd assessed the situation quickly enough to know bringing them in would be a mistake. That was useful information. It meant he didn't think he could simply take what he wanted. Not yet. "I won't take much of your time," he said. He had a voice built for reassurance, low, steady, practiced. "I know you've been through a lot, getting settled here, but the water rights question needs to be resolved, and I'd rather do it amicably." "I agree," Clara said. "Show me your documentation." He produced a document from his coat. She took it, looked at it. Surveyor's notation, a claim filed on the North Ridge Spring, dated 8 months ago. 8 months ago, while Silas was alive. "This was filed while Mr. Mercer was living," she said. "The claim was filed legally with the county surveyor's office, yes. Did Mr. Mercer know about it?" Talbot's expression was very steady. "Mr. Mercer and I had an ongoing discussion about the water source. The filing was a formality to establish position during that discussion. He never agreed to it. The agreement was in process." Clara turned the document over. The surveyor's seal was real. The date was real. The claim language was... She read the claim language twice. "This claims prescriptive rights based on prior use," she said. "Talbot cattle using the spring prior to the Mercer homestead filing." She looked up. "The Mercer homestead was filed 16 years ago. How long have you had your operation in this valley?" A half-second pause. "Barely there." 11 years? Then your cattle cannot have used the spring prior to the Mercer filing." She put the document down on her side of the table. "Which makes this claim fraudulent." The room was quiet. Outside, one of Talbot's horses shifted and stamped. The roof creaked. Talbot looked at her with the look of a man revising everything he thought he knew about a situation, and Clara saw, clearly, without satisfaction, just as a fact, that he had come here expecting a woman he could reason with, or pressure, or wait out. He had not prepared for this. "That's a serious accusation," he said. His voice had changed. Not threatening, not yet, just changed. "I have the original homestead filing date," she said. "It's registered at the county seat. I've confirmed it with the clerk. I also have the guardianship document, registered and witnessed, which gives me legal standing to contest any claim against this property." She kept her hands flat on the table. "And I have a letter from the Founders Trust, which has a lawyer currently traveling toward Red Hollow who would be very interested in reviewing your claim documentation." She slid Hector's letter across the table. Not the trust letter. She kept that where it was, visible, but not offered. "That addresses the debt question," she said. "In case Galt reports back to you." Talbot looked at Hector's letter without touching it. Behind Clara, from the doorway to the sleeping room, there was a sound. She didn't turn around. She knew who it was. Eli stepped up and stood beside her chair. Just stood there, 10 years old, with his bare feet on the floorboards and his hands at his sides. He didn't say anything. He just stood. A moment later, June came through the front door and stood on the other side of the table. She'd been outside, close enough to hear, which Clara had known when she arranged the chairs. and she looked at Talbot with 15 years of frontier hard living in her face and not a single thing in her expression that was afraid. Talbot looked at them, the woman, the boy, the girl, the papers on the table between them. He had 2 men outside and they had a lawyer coming. He had a fraudulent claim and they had the original filing date. He had expectations and they had nothing to lose. "I'll need time to review the documentation," he said. His voice was professional. Careful. The voice of a man who has decided that retreat is not defeat if it's orderly enough. "Of course," Clara said, "the Founders Trust lawyer will be here within the week. I'd suggest having your surveyor's records available." Talbot stood. He retrieved Hector's letter without being invited to, which she noted. He looked at Clara one more time with the look of a man filing something away for later use. "Good day, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Good day, Mr. Talbot." He went out. Through the window, she watched him mount his horse, say something brief to his men, and ride east at a pace that was measured and unhurried because pride required it. Eli let out a breath beside her. It was the longest breath she'd ever heard. "Did that work?" he said. Clara looked at the papers on the table, the guardianship document, Silas's last deliberate act, Hector's letter, one honest man's careful handwriting, the trust reply arrived by near impossible luck at near impossible speed. All of it held together by paper and nerve, and the particular stubbornness of people who have nothing left to lose and have somehow made that into an advantage. "For now," she said. June sat down in the chair Talbot had just left. She sat down slowly, like someone who has been standing for a very long time. "For now," she repeated. She put her hands flat on the table, Clara's gesture, though she didn't seem to notice. "What next?" Clara picked up the papers one by one and straightened them into a neat stack. "We hold," she said. "You said part 4. Lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại." Part 4 lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phủ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình, viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng, có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đàn bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show 1534 CE 34. Claude responded. Part 4. Outsmarting Power. Part 4. Outsmarting Power. Holding, as it turned out, was not a passive thing. The week after Talbot's visit had a different quality to it than the weeks before. A tautness in the air, the way weather feels before it commits to something. Clara felt it in the way she slept, which was lightly and with one ear toward the yard. She felt it in the way Eli started checking the fence line every morning without being asked. Even the dogs had changed their habits, spending more time near the cabin than under the barn. The Founders Trust lawyer arrived on a Wednesday, which was not within the week Clara had promised, but close enough. His name was Arthur Voss, and he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 32, with wire-rimmed glasses and the deliberate, careful manner of someone who'd learned early that people underestimated him and had decided to use it. He rode in on a rented horse that was clearly making him miserable, and he climbed down in the yard with visible relief and looked at the cabin and the ridge and the wide, difficult country around them, with the expression of a man from a city reminding himself why he'd chosen this work. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "I've read your letter 3 times. You write clearly." "I had to," she said. "I needed you to come." He almost smiled. "Show me the documents." They sat at the table for 2 hours, just the two of them, while June kept the children occupied and Eli found tasks to do within earshot. Voss read everything Clara had assembled: the guardianship document, the registered copy from the county seat, Hector's letter, the debt papers with Galt's fraudulent item, and Talbot's water rights claim with its impossible date. He read the way lawyers read, which is to say, he went back over things and made small sounds that meant nothing individually, but accumulated into a picture. When he was done, he took off his glasses and cleaned them with his shirt, which she'd already learned meant he was thinking. The guardianship is solid, he said. Prentice does good work. It was registered correctly and the county record is clean. He picked up Talbot's claim. This is sloppier than I'd expect from someone with Talbot's resources. He expected it not to be questioned, Clara said. Yes, that's the problem with forging documents for people you've already decided can't fight back. He set the claim down. The prescriptive use date is wrong, as you identified. But more than that, the surveyor's notation doesn't match the office's standard format for this county. I've seen enough of them. This was prepared elsewhere and submitted here. He tapped the corner, which means either his regular man didn't do it or his regular man refused. Either one is useful. Either one is very useful. He looked at Galt's debt paper. The fraudulent item here is obvious once you have Blaine's statement. The others I'd want to verify, but even if 2 or 3 are legitimate, the fabricated one poisons the whole account legally. He folded his hands on the table. Miss Hawthorne, what do you want to happen? She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it in the careful, practical way she thought about fence posts and barrel seams and cornbread. Not what would be ideal, but what would hold. I want the water rights claim dismissed, she said. Formally, on record, so it can't be refiled with different dates. I want Galt's fraudulent debt struck from the account and the rest verified independently. And I want it known, publicly, in the way that things get known in a place like this, that this property has legal standing and won't be taken. Voss looked at her steadily. You understand that last part isn't something I can do through the courts. I know. I'll handle that part myself. He put his glasses back on. Then I think we have a case. Not a fast one. These things move slowly in frontier counties. But a strong one. He paused. Talbot will lawyer up. He has the resources. I know that too. He may find other pressure to apply while the legal process moves, things that don't require documents. She met his eyes. I know. And you want to proceed. Mr. Voss, Clara said, I came to Red Hollow to marry a man I'd never met and make a life out of something practical. The man died before I got here. The life is... She looked around the cabin, at the fireplace with May's small boot prints in the ash beside it, at the window where the light came through and showed every crack in the wall. More complicated than I planned. She looked back at him. I'm not leaving, so yes, I want to proceed. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has assessed a situation and found it adequate. I'll need to ride into town and send some correspondence, and I'll want to speak to Blaine in person. He stood and reached for his hat. Lock that guardianship document somewhere better than a bag. What do you suggest? Do you trust the bank in town? Not yet. Smart. He thought about it. Keep a copy here and give me one to hold at the trust. 2 points of record are harder to make disappear than one. He moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Talbot is going to find out about the trust's involvement, if he doesn't already know. When he does, he may try to negotiate rather than fight. Don't accept anything that trades water rights for debt forgiveness. The debt is already compromised. It's worth very little as leverage. The water is worth everything. I know, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, I believe you do. And he went out. June came in from the back room. She'd been listening again. Clara had stopped minding it, had come to depend on it in some way she couldn't quite articulate. 2 sets of ears were better than one, and June's memory was exact. He's good, June said. It wasn't praise exactly, more like a technical assessment. Yes. Is he expensive? The trust works on contingency for homestead cases. If we win, they take a small percentage of the property value assessment. If we lose, Clara paused. We were losing anyway. So. June looked at the table where the papers had been. What did he mean about other pressure? Things that don't require documents. Clara considered how to answer. June was 15 and already knew what hard looked like. There was no point in softening it. He meant that Talbot might try other ways to make staying here uncomfortable, she said. Interfering with suppliers, making it difficult to sell cattle or buy grain, social pressure, convincing people in town that dealing with us is a liability. She paused. Maybe more than that. I don't know. June was quiet. We already have trouble buying in town. Stoddard at the general store has been short with us since Papa died. Won't extend credit. I know. Clara had noticed Stoddard, had been managing around him. That may be Talbot's influence, or it may just be a man who doesn't want to deal with a household of children and no obvious income. Either way, we need to work around it. She sat down. There are 3 other farms between here and town. The Brennan place, the Widow Sato's, and the Keller family. Do you know them? Some. Brennan used to buy hay from Papa. Mrs. Sato brings eggs to town on Fridays. She and Papa had an arrangement sometimes. The Kellers, June frowned. They keep to themselves. Brennan and Sato, then. I want to talk to them. About what? About the fact that if Talbot gets the North Ridge water, the whole valley dries up in late summer. Not just us. Clara looked at her. We're not the only ones with something to lose here. We're just the ones he started with because we looked weakest. June absorbed this. The calculation behind her eyes was one Clara had seen before. The moment when a person stops thinking about their own situation and starts thinking about it as part of a larger pattern. When? June said. This week. Can you manage here for a few hours? I've been managing here for 6 weeks. I know. I meant with the roof situation and... Yes, you can manage. Clara almost smiled. Take that as the compliment it is. June looked like she didn't know what to do with a compliment and had decided to ignore it. Take Eli, she said, and be back before dark. Margaret Sato was 61 years old, had buried a husband and a son, and kept a farm running through both losses, and had the kind of face that had finished being surprised by things some years back. She listened to Clara at her kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea, and her expression neutral, and when Clara finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I know about the spring, she said. Knew about Talbot's interest. Silas mentioned it. She set her cup down. Silas was a private man. Proud. He didn't ask for help easy. His children are less proud, Clara said. By necessity. Mrs. Sato looked at her with the directness of someone who respects plain talk. What do you need from me? Nothing yet. I want you to know what's happening, and I want to know whether if it comes to a public question, a county review, a formal dispute, we'd have your support. My name on something? Possibly. A statement about the valley water situation, about what it means for smaller operations if Talbot controls the spring. Mrs. Sato looked out her window at her own land, small and well-kept, with a kitchen garden and a chicken coop that was in better repair than the Mercer barn had any right to be. She was quiet for long enough that Clara thought she was going to say no. Harold Brennan will follow if I go first, she said finally. He's cautious, but he's not stupid. He knows which way the water runs. She looked back at Clara. You understand this puts me in a difficult position with Talbot. Yes, I do business in this valley. My eggs go to 4 households that also buy from Talbot's operation. I know. You're asking me to take a risk. Yes, Clara said. I am. Mrs. Sato picked up her cup again. Come back to me when you have something specific to sign. I'll have an answer for you then. She paused. Those children managing all right? Better, Claire said. Slowly better. The girl, June. She said the name with something particular in her voice. She came to ask me for eggs once, early on, right after Silas died. She walked here, and she asked me very carefully, like every word cost her something. Mrs. Sato shook her head slowly. I should have done more than... I told myself it wasn't my business. Clara didn't say anything to that. It wasn't her place to absolve her. Tell June I have extra eggs this week, Mrs. Sato said. She doesn't need to ask. Right. Brennan was harder. He was a big, slow-talking man who said everything twice and agreed to nothing on the first visit, as a matter of principle rather than skepticism. Clara had to go back twice, and on the second visit she brought Eli, who had the particular quality of silent honesty that adults occasionally find more convincing than anything a grown person can say. Brennan looked at Eli for a long time, then looked at Clara, then looked at his own fields, and said he'd sign a Valley Water statement if the situation came to it. He didn't say it warmly, but he said it. That was 3 names, 4 including Hector Blaine. It wasn't an army, but it was enough to make a noise. The news about Talbot's claim had spread through the valley by mid-October in the way news spreads in isolated places, imperfectly, partially, accumulated through fragments and half-conversations and things overheard at the mill. Some of what spread was accurate. Some of it was distorted in ways that were actually useful. Someone had heard that the Mercer woman had a legal team from back east, which wasn't quite true, but wasn't entirely wrong either. And that small inflation of Clara's resources seemed to have given certain people pause about how openly they sided with Talbot. Stoddard at the general store, notably, had become somewhat less short. Clara had noticed. She hadn't mentioned it. Galt, for his part, had gone quiet. He hadn't returned to the ranch. Voss had sent a formal letter to his address challenging the fraudulent debt item and requesting documentation for the remaining claims. No response had come, which Voss said was common and not yet meaningful, but Clara thought it meant Galt was waiting to see how the Talbot situation resolved before deciding how much of his own exposure was worth defending. The legal machinery moved the way Voss had warned, slowly, with the grinding indifference of a system that has too much to do and not enough people to do it. A county review was scheduled for the water rights claim. A date was set. November 14th, 6 weeks away. 6 weeks was a long time in a place with an uncertain winter coming. The roof came down on a Tuesday. Not all of it, just the left section, the one that had been leaning and groaning since Clara arrived. It came down at 2 in the morning, under the weight of the first early snow, with a sound like a long, slow argument finally ending. Clara was awake before the sound finished, and she had the children out of the back room and into the main room in under 2 minutes, moving by feel in the dark, counting by touch. May, Thomas, the twins, Harriet, Eli, June, 6, 7, all of them, fine. They stood in the main room in their nightclothes in the cold, while snow sifted down through the new gap in the ceiling where the left section had been, and Thomas started crying quietly, which he hadn't done since the week after Silas died. And May, oddly, did not cry at all, but instead looked at the hole in the ceiling with a scientific kind of interest. "It's snowing inside," May said. "Yes," Clara said. "Is that bad?" "We'll fix it." "Tonight?" "No, not tonight. Tonight we move beds to this side of the room." They did that. It took an hour, everyone helping in the overlapping, poorly coordinated way that a family manages things at 2 in the morning. Eli on one end of a mattress, Daniel on the other, going different directions at once. June organizing with her hair loose and her voice low and firm. Harriet holding the lamp. Ruth holding May, who had decided to be helpful by describing what everyone was doing in real time. Thomas, after a while, stopped crying and helped carry pillows, which was enough. By 3 in the morning, they had a functioning sleeping arrangement on the intact side of the cabin, somewhat crowded, somewhat cold, but adequate. Clara built the fire up high enough to compensate for the heat loss through the gap, and then sat beside it with a blanket and didn't sleep again. In the morning, in the gray early light with snow still coming down light and steady outside, she climbed up on the roof and looked at what they had. It was bad. She'd known it was going to be bad. The 3 rotted beams had taken 4 adjacent ones down with them when they went, and the whole left section was open to the sky now. Covering it with canvas would keep out precipitation in the short term, but wouldn't survive a serious winter storm, and Red Hollow's winters were not known for their gentleness. She climbed down and found Eli at the bottom waiting. "Timber," he said. It wasn't a question, and someone who knows what they're doing with it. She looked at him. "Brennan, does he build?" "He helped Papa with the barn years back. He knows what he's doing." "Would he come?" Eli thought about this with his habitual honesty. "If we asked right." "How do we ask right?" he considered. "He's got a fence line that runs along the north property, and Papa always let him run it through our land because it was easier for him. He's been worried about whether that arrangement would hold now that Papa's gone." He paused. "If you tell him the arrangement holds, he might want to show good faith." Clara looked at him, 10 years old. When did you get that practical? He looked slightly embarrassed. I've been listening to you. She went to Brennan that afternoon, on horseback, through snow that was light enough to ride through and cold enough to mean business. She told him the fence arrangement would continue under her guardianship, same terms as before. Brennan listened to this with his habitual thoroughness, and then said he supposed he could bring his two boys out and take a look at the roof situation and see what could be managed. He came Thursday with his two sons, large, quiet young men who had their father's build and slightly less of his caution, and a wagon with timber in it, and they spent 2 days on the Mercer roof in the cold with Clara and Eli handing things up, and June keeping everyone fed with better food than usual because Mrs. Sato had sent potatoes and a cured ham with her egg delivery that week, apparently as a statement of intent. The repaired section wasn't elegant. The new timber was lighter than the old, and the angles weren't quite right, and in one place there was a gap that had to be addressed with pitch and canvas because they ran short of the right-sized beam. But when they were done, and Clara stood in the yard and looked at it, the roof was level for the first time since she'd arrived. "It'll hold," Brennan said, which was an echo of what Eli had said about the fence, and Clara was beginning to understand that in this part of the world, "it'll hold" was the highest form of praise available. "Thank you," she said. She meant it completely. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the directness of it. "The fence arrangement," he said. "You'll want to put that in writing. Proper." "I will. Voss can draw it up when he's back." Brennan nodded. He was getting ready to leave, his sons already on the wagon, and then he stopped and said without looking at her, "Talbot came to see me." Clara went still. "When?" "Week ago. Before the snow." He pulled at his glove. Said there was going to be a county review and that the Mercer claim was complicated and it might be better for valley businesses to stay out of it. He finally looked at her. Said the water situation was going to get sorted one way or the other regardless. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I'd think about it." He paused. "I thought about it." Clara waited. "The spring feeds the creek that runs along my south field," Brennan said. "If Talbot controls the spring, he controls what comes through to me." He looked at the fixed roof. "A man who'll file false documents is a man who'll close a water gate. I've got kids too, Miss Hawthorne." "I know you do." He climbed up to the wagon. "November 14th, he said. The county review." "Yes, I'll be there." He clicked to the horses and didn't look back, which was either because he'd said everything he meant to say or because he was the kind of man who treated decisions like fence posts. You drove them in and moved on. No point in examining them further once they were set. November 14th came up fast and cold. The county seat was 40 miles and the road was hard with early frost, and Clara left at first light with Voss, who had ridden back from his previous business 2 days before and had spent those 2 days reviewing documents with an intensity that reminded her of the way June read. Slowly, completely, going back over things until they were certain. She left Eli in charge, which at 10 years old was an irregular sort of responsibility, but Eli was an irregular sort of 10-year-old, and June was there besides, and Harriet had proven herself capable of managing Thomas and May and the twins through worse mornings than this. "Come back," May said at the door. It was her standard goodbye now, delivered without drama, just a requirement she stated as fact. "I'll be back by nightfall," Clara said. "Come back," May said again, satisfied, and went inside. The county seat was a town called Millhaven that had a courthouse the county was clearly proud of. Red brick, 2 stories, with a clock tower that ran about 8 minutes slow, which Clara noticed while they were waiting outside the clerk's office for the review to begin. The waiting room had 4 other people in it, none of them Talbot, which Voss said was typical for this kind of preliminary proceeding. Talbot arrived 12 minutes late with a lawyer Clara didn't recognize. Older than Voss, with the compact authority of a man who'd been winning cases in frontier counties for 30 years. He looked at Voss with professional assessment. Voss looked back with the slightly too steady expression of someone choosing not to show what they feel. Clara sat beside Voss and put her file on the table in front of her, and did not look at Talbot again after the first moment. The reviewing officer was a county clerk named Morrison, who had the worn-down patience of a man who has seen too many property disputes and expects to see more. He read both claims, asked several questions, listened to Voss lay out the date discrepancy and the prescriptive use argument, and looked at the supporting materials. the homestead filing date, the signed Blaine letter, the founder's trust documentation, with the slow, methodical attention of a man who wants to be thorough because he knows whatever he decides today will be contested by someone. Talbot's lawyer argued that the claim date was a clerical error and that the underlying intent of the prescriptive use argument was valid regardless. Morrison looked at him over his papers and said that intent was not documentation, and documentation was what he had in front of him. The session lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Morrison said he was not prepared to rule definitively on the day, but that the prescriptive use claim as filed had a material defect that would require correction and resubmission before it could be considered valid. In the meantime, the existing Mercer guardianship document stood as the governing instrument for property decisions, and no water rights transfer could be processed against the property without guardian consent. It was not a victory exactly. It was the door held open one more inch. Voss, in the hallway afterward, with Morrison's clerk typing up the session notes behind a frosted glass window, said quietly, "That's better than I expected, frankly. Morrison is conservative. He could have tabled the whole thing for 6 months." What does Talbot do now? He corrects the filing, which means either finding a way to make the date work, which it can't, or reframing the entire claim. That buys us time. He folded his glasses into his pocket. And during that time, the fraudulent debt becomes the more immediate issue. Galt's silence on the challenge letter is not sustainable. Either he responds and defends something he can't defend, or he withdraws the item. And if he withdraws it, the rest of the account becomes negotiable at real numbers, not inflated ones. Voss looked at her. You may actually end up with a workable debt situation. Not comfortable, but workable. Clara thought about $11. About thin soup and dense cornbread. About a roof that was level now. About a fence that would hold through winter. About a boy counting days and a girl who'd put papers on a table without pushing them forward. Workable is fine, she said. When they came out of the courthouse, Brennan was in the street. He'd come 40 miles too, without telling anyone he was going to. Him and Harold Sato, Mrs. Sato's nephew who worked the farm with her, and a man Clara didn't recognize who turned out to be a neighbor of the Brennan family from a few miles further south, a thin-weathered man named Cole, who said he'd heard there was a water situation and he had a creek that fed from the same source, so he supposed he should know what was happening. They stood in the cold street outside the Millhaven courthouse. 5 people who had all traveled 40 miles for different reasons and ended up at the same place at the same time, which was not quite coordination and not quite coincidence. Talbot came out of the courthouse with his lawyer. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at Clara. He looked at the people beside her. He looked at Voss with the flat professional appraisal of a man reassessing a board position. He said nothing. He got into his carriage. Clara watched the carriage go. Then she turned to the men beside her and said, "Thank you for coming, all of you." Cole shrugged. He had the specific ease of a man who doesn't make speeches. "Got water to protect same as anyone." He looked at the courthouse. "We win?" "Not yet," Claire said, "but we're still in it." That seemed to satisfy him. He pulled his hat down against the wind and started for his horse, and Brennan followed him, and young Sato said he'd tell his aunt, and then he was gone too, and the street was just a street again, cold and unremarkable, with a clock tower running 8 minutes slow and the smell of wood smoke coming from somewhere down the block. Voss said they should start back before the light got too low. Clara looked at the courthouse one more time, at the brick, the slow clock, the closed door. Inside, Morrison's clerk was typing up notes that would go into a file that would sit in a cabinet that would outlast all of them, and in that file was the name Clara Hawthorne, written down as a party with legal standing to fight for something. She turned her horse toward the road home. The 40 miles back felt shorter than the 40 miles there, not because anything had been resolved, not cleanly, not yet, but because the shape of the thing had changed. What had been a slow, invisible siege had become something visible and contested and public meant that it could be won or lost openly rather than simply absorbed in silence. She got back to the ranch by nightfall, as she'd promised. May was at the door before she had the horse put away, standing in the cold in her boots with her coat not properly buttoned, and she said, "You came back with the satisfaction of someone whose expectations have been met." And Clara said yes, she came back and buttoned the coat. Inside, the fire was high, and the soup on the stove was better than it used to be. Mrs. Sato's potatoes, some dried herbs Harriet had found in the back of the supply shelf, actual flavor this time. And Thomas talked at supper, not much, but some, about something one of the chickens had done that afternoon that apparently bore describing. The twins had a fight and resolved it before anyone had to intervene. June served the soup with the spare, efficient movements of someone who'd done it 1,000 times and might do it 1,000 more. And when she set the bowl in front of Clara, she didn't say anything, but she paused a half-second longer than she needed to. That was all. That was enough. After supper, with the children settled and the fire lower and the cold pressing against the newly solid roof, Clara sat at the table with the papers spread out in front of her, not reviewing them, just having them near. The guardianship document, Hector's letter, Voss's notes from the session, the founder's trust correspondence. The weight of the bag had felt like burden when she'd started carrying it. It felt different now. Not lighter exactly, just more like something she knew how to carry. June came out of the back room and stood in the doorway, and for a moment she just looked at Clara at the table, the papers, the dying fire. Her expression was unreadable, which was normal, but she stayed in the doorway longer than she needed to. Eli wants to know if we're going to be all right, she said finally. Clara looked at the papers. At the roof overhead that was level now. At the fire that was low but still burning. Tell him we're in it, she said, and we're not done. June stayed another moment. Then she said, quietly, without ceremony, something she hadn't said to Clara before. Good, she said, and went back to bed. You said, Part 5. Louis, viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5. Louis, viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phủ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc, kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. 1538. Claude responded, Part 5. The house that refused to fall. Part 5. The house that refused to fall. Galt withdrew the fraudulent debt item on a Monday, 11 days after Voss's formal challenge letter, in a single-paragraph response that used the phrase administrative error 4 times in 4 sentences, which was the legal equivalent of a man backing out of a room while pretending he'd always been walking that direction. Voss sent Clara a copy with a note in the margin that said simply, as expected, now the real number. The real number, the legitimate debt, once the fabricated item was stripped out and the remaining claims verified independently, was $112. Not nothing. In the context of a ranch running on near empty, $112 was a serious weight. But it was not the crushing, impossible figure Galt had originally presented. It was a number that had a shape you could work with, that you could look at and think, all right, how? Clara spent 3 evenings at the table working out how. She sold 2 of the older cattle, not the breeding stock, not the animals the ranch needed to sustain itself, but 2 steers that had been eating through winter feed without contributing much, a decision Eli had quietly agreed with when she asked him. That brought in $60 from a buyer in Millhaven that Brennan connected her to, a fair price for the season. Mrs. Sato, without being asked and without making it ceremonious, sent word that she'd like to arrange a formal egg supply agreement with the ranch. The Mercer hens produced well, she said, and she had more demand than her own birds could meet. That arrangement, drawn up simply in 2 paragraphs that Voss approved, produced a small but reliable monthly income. The remaining $52 she negotiated into a payment arrangement with Galt's representative, not Galt himself, who had apparently developed a reluctance to appear in person, spread over 8 months at no interest, because when Voss pointed out in writing that pursuing interest on a debt that had been fraudulently inflated would be an interesting thing to argue in front of a county judge, the representative agreed that no interest seemed reasonable. By the second week of December, the debt was structured, the roof was solid, and the water rights claim was formally suspended pending Talbot's resubmission, which Voss said could take months and might never come at all if Talbot decided the cost of continuing wasn't worth what he'd get. It wasn't over, but it had changed shape in the way that problems sometimes do when you refuse to look away from them. From something vast and formless into something specific and finite, something with edges you could see and work against. The valley winter came in hard after Christmas. 3 weeks of cold that drove the temperature low enough to crack the water trough twice and kept everyone inside more than was comfortable for 7 children in a cabin that, however improved, was still one cabin. Clara learned things about each of them that you only learn when there's nowhere to go. That Thomas had a talent for drawing that he'd kept entirely private, filling the backs of old receipts with careful detailed sketches of animals and tools and the view from the window. That the twins had an entire private language between them that wasn't quite words, more like an economy of looks and half-sounds that communicated complete thoughts. That Harriet was working through the math in Clara's old account books from Ohio, which Clara had brought in the suitcase as reference material, and which Harriet had apparently located and been reading methodically for weeks. "You were underpaid," Harriet said one evening, looking up from the ledger. She was 12 years old and entirely serious about it. Clara looked over at her. "How do you figure?" "The store's revenue went up 14% in your second year, but your salary stayed the same." She pointed at the column. "Right there." Clara looked at the numbers she hadn't thought about in 2 years. "You're right," she said. Harriet looked back at the ledger with the expression of someone confirming a suspicion. "People do that," she said. "They assume you won't notice." "Some do," Clara said. "I'm going to notice," Harriet said. Not as a statement of ambition, more like a decision she'd already made and was simply announcing. "Good," Clara said. The letter from Talbot came in February. Not a legal document this time. An actual letter, handwritten, on good paper, in the careful script of a man who'd had some education and wanted you to know it. It was 4 paragraphs long, and its essential argument was that the water rights dispute had been a misunderstanding arising from poor communication, that he bore no ill will toward the Mercer family or its guardian, and that he was prepared to let the matter rest if the ranch was equally prepared to do the same. Clara read it twice. Then she gave it to June. June read it once, put it down. "He's not apologizing," she said. "No. He's just stopping." "Yes. Because it costs him more to continue than to quit." She looked at the letter with the flat assessment of someone who has stopped expecting people to be better than they are. He was never going to apologize. "No," Claire said. "Men like Talbot don't apologize. They recalculate." June thought about this. "Is that enough? That he stops?" "For the ranch, yes. For justice." Clara paused. "Not really. But I don't have a mechanism for justice. I have a mechanism for keeping this place and keeping you all safe, and that's what worked." June was quiet for a moment. Outside, the winter light was thin and white across the yard, and the repaired roof was holding under 6 inches of snow, and somewhere inside Thomas was making a sound that meant he'd finished one drawing and was looking for another scrap of paper. "I thought it would feel different," June said, "when it was over." "It doesn't feel like I thought either," Clara said, honestly. "I thought I'd feel certain about something, like the ground settled." She looked at the letter. "It mostly just feels like there's a different set of things to do now." June almost smiled. That expression Clara had been collecting for months, each one slightly more visible than the last. "Yeah," she said, "that sounds right." Clara sent a brief, formal reply to Talbot, acknowledging his letter. Voss, when informed, said it was the correct move and that the water rights claim had been quietly withdrawn from the county register 2 weeks prior, which he'd been waiting to confirm before mentioning. The withdrawal was permanent without refiling. and refiling with corrected documentation would require materials that didn't exist. So the matter was, as a legal question, concluded. He rode out to the ranch to deliver this news in person, which Clara thought was more than the situation required until she understood that Voss was one of those people who needs to see the outcome of a thing, who closes a file not when the papers are in order, but when he can look at the people involved and confirm that the papers meant something. He sat at the table and drank coffee that was still not very good and looked around the cabin. At the level roof, the children moving in and out, May showing him a rock she'd found that she considered significant, Eli at the other end of the table doing figures for the spring planting. And he looked like a man filing something away in a personal record separate from his professional one. "You did well," he said to Clara, not expansively, just plainly. "We did," she said. He accepted the correction without argument. "What happens now?" She'd been thinking about that. The question of what happens now had a different quality than the questions that had come before it. Those had been urgent, driven by threat and scarcity. This one was slower, more open, almost frightening in its openness. "The spring planting," she said. "The debt payments. The egg arrangement. Fixing the gate on the south field." She paused. "Harriet needs schooling beyond what I can give her. There's a teacher in Red Hollow. I've heard she's good. I want to talk to her about some kind of arrangement." Voss nodded. "And you?" he said. Not intrusively, just a question. Clara thought about it. She thought about the train platform, the letter, the $11. She thought about a barefoot boy turning a hat in his hands. She thought about partnership, the word she'd turned over for 9 days on a train, what she'd thought it meant and what she'd found it actually was. Not a thing you agreed to at the start, but a thing you built by staying and staying and staying again each morning when leaving would have been easier. "I'm here," she said. It was a complete answer. Spring came to the ridge the way it always did in that country. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard frost, followed by 2 weeks of mud, followed by the first genuine green pushing up through the dead grass in the low fields. The creek ran full from snowmelt, and the spring on the north ridge ran the way it always ran, constant, indifferent, cold. And Clara went up there once in March, alone this time, and sat beside the pool for a while. She thought about Silas Mercer. She did that sometimes, tried to construct him from the evidence available, the way you reconstruct a building from its foundation. A private man, proud, right about some things, wrong about others. A man who'd sat in a lawyer's office in the last week of his life and written her name into a document before he knew her face. Who had looked at a situation clearly enough to understand he might not be in it much longer, and had done the most practical thing he could think of, which was find someone to stay. She didn't know if he'd been a good man. She thought he'd been a complicated one, which was different, and in her experience more common. She thought he'd loved his children with the inarticulate, expressed-through-action love of a man who doesn't know how to say things directly. She thought the children knew it, even June, especially June, and that they were all still figuring out how to carry it, and would be for a long time. She sat by the spring and let the cold air move around her and didn't ask it for anything, just sat. When she came back down, Eli was at the bottom of the trail with the horse, having appeared there the way he often appeared in places she needed someone. Not because he'd been sent, but because he paid attention and acted on what he noticed. He didn't ask where she'd been. He handed her the reins. "Thomas wants to show you something," he said. Thomas had, in the months since winter ended, migrated from the backs of old receipts to actual paper that Clara had brought back from Mill Haven. Not a lot of it. Paper was not free, but enough to work with. He'd filled 12 sheets front and back with drawings that were, by any honest assessment, remarkable. Animals mostly, but also buildings, structures he invented, sprawling complicated things with multiple roof lines and additions built on additions. He'd drawn the Mercer cabin itself 7 different times, each version slightly larger than the last. He showed Clara the newest one that evening after supper. It covered both sides of a sheet and spilled onto a second. It was the Ridge House as he imagined it could be. 2 full stories on the main structure, a proper covered porch, a large kitchen, what might have been a dormitory wing extending to the left. "What is this?" Clara asked. "It's what it could be," Thomas said. He was 7 and talked like he was 9 when he talked at all. which was the particular effect of a child who'd spent time listening. If more people came, he pointed at the dormitory wing, for people who needed somewhere. Clara looked at the drawing, at the careful lines, the thought that had gone into the proportions. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who has put something real in front of a person and is waiting to see if they can see it. "That's a good idea," she said. He nodded, satisfied, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already known. The idea, once Thomas had drawn it into existence, didn't go away. It sat in the back of Clara's thinking the way good ideas do. Not urgent, not demanding, just present, acquiring detail over time. The ridge had space. The ranch had a working water source and a repaired structure, and increasingly, a reputation in the valley as a place that had fought and held. Mrs. Sato had taken to sending travelers who needed a meal to the Mercer place when they came through, and twice that spring Clara had found people on the porch. Once a woman with 2 small children heading west without enough food, once an older man whose horse had gone lame, and had fed them without ceremony and let them rest and sent them on. It wasn't a plan yet. It was a habit that wanted to become one. By the time the second summer came and the valley grass went yellow and the spring on the ridge ran cold and the creek stayed full, Talbot's water no longer a question, just the land doing what it had always done. The Mercer place had started to change, not dramatically, not all at once. A second sleeping room added to the back of the cabin, Brennan's boys helping with the timber, because the children were growing and the one room wasn't enough. A proper kitchen shelf, a window in the front room that actually kept out the wind. Clara wrote to the Founders Trust and to 2 other organizations she'd found in a legal circular Voss had left behind, asking about support structures for frontier families in difficulty. The replies were slow and partial, but they came. It turned out there were people who thought the same thing she was thinking, who were interested in the same questions. Not charity exactly, but structured support, temporary shelter, a known place. She didn't call it anything formal. The valley called it what they called it, the Ridge House. June turned 16 in July, and Clara marked the occasion with a cake that was imperfect by any standard, uneven, slightly sunken in the middle, the frosting more of an intention than an achievement, but which June ate 2 pieces of without comment, which was its own form of celebration. They sat on the porch that evening, just the 2 of them, with the summer dark coming in and the sound of the younger children through the window, not quite settling down for the night, and the ridge a dark shape against a sky that still held a little blue at the western edge. June said, without particular preamble, "I was going to leave." Clara looked at her. "After Papa died, before you came." She was looking at the ridge, not at Clara. "I had it worked out. I was going to take Eli and Harriet and leave the little ones with the Pools. They would have taken them, I think, even though they'd already said they wouldn't. People say things, and then when the moment comes..." She stopped. "I had it worked out. A town 2 valleys west, there was work for women who could keep accounts. I can keep accounts. I thought I could take care of the 3 of us and send money back for the little ones." She paused. "I thought that was the only option." Clara didn't say anything. "It wasn't?" June said. "But I didn't know that yet." She finally looked sideways at Clara. "You staying?" That was... She stopped again. June had never been easy with gratitude. It sat in her the way all difficult emotions sat in her, visible only at the edges. "That changed what was possible," she said finally. "Not just for the ranch. I mean what I thought was possible. For us." Clara looked at the last blue at the edge of the sky. She thought about what she could say. She thought about what was true. "I didn't know I was staying when I stayed," she said. "I just didn't get back on the train." "Why not?" "Because Eli asked me not to." She paused. "And because I'd come a long way, and I was tired, and it seemed like too much to turn around when I'd barely arrived." She looked at June. "And because you were 15 and running a ranch on your own, and it seemed wrong to add to the number of people who'd already left you." June was quiet for a moment. "That's not a very heroic reason." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not. People in town think you're..." June made a small sound. "Mrs. Poole told someone you were remarkable. I heard it said back to me." "Mrs. Poole thinks everyone who doesn't leave is remarkable. It's a low bar. June made that sound again, the almost laugh, and this time it went further than it usually did. Became for a moment an actual brief laugh, quiet and real, and Clara thought, there it is. That's what it sounds like. I don't think the bar is as low as you think, June said, when she'd composed herself. Staying is harder than people think. She looked at the ridge. Papa stayed his whole life. I used to think that was easy for him, that he just was here and kept being here. But it's not easy. You have to keep deciding it. That was a true thing, and a hard-won one, and Clara let it sit without adding to it. They sat on the porch until the blue entirely left the sky, and the stars came in, and May appeared in the doorway to report that Daniel had taken her blanket, and the situation required adult arbitration. June went in to adjudicate, which she did with the blunt efficiency of a judge who has handled this case before and doesn't need additional testimony. Clara stayed on the porch a few more minutes, listening to the argument resolve inside. Daniel's defense, May's counterargument, the conclusive ruling, the subsequent peace, and she thought about a word she'd had in her head since the train, all those months ago, partnership. She'd thought it meant a transaction, something agreed to and settled, two people deciding on terms. It wasn't that. It was nothing like that. It was a porch in the dark. It was a girl who had been ready to leave, who had stayed, who was in there now settling a blanket dispute with complete authority. It was a boy who'd stood in the dust and counted weeks. It was cornbread that nobody pretended was good. It was a water spring that ran the same regardless of who was fighting over it. It was Thomas's drawing of the house that could be, folded and kept in the wooden box where important papers lived. It was deciding, again and again, in small ordinary moments, not to leave. The years moved through the ridge the way years do when you're too busy to count them carefully. Eli grew into the kind of young man who does what needs doing and doesn't announce it, who could read a field or a balance sheet with equal competence, who had his father's watchfulness without his father's reluctance to ask for help. He was 18 when he rode to Mill Haven to register the formal operating plan for the Ridge House as a recognized shelter property, and he signed the papers himself because Clara made him. "This is yours," she said. "It should have your name on it." And he signed with the same careful deliberateness he did everything, and folded his copy and put it in his shirt pocket and didn't say much about it, which was how you knew it mattered. Harriet went to the teacher in Red Hollow at 13 and had, within a year, moved through everything the teacher had available to teach her. A school in Mill Haven took her at 15, on a partial scholarship that Voss helped arrange. She came back in the summers and kept the Ridge House accounts with an efficiency that made Clara quietly proud and outwardly restrained about it. She wanted to study law, she announced at 16, which surprised no one who had watched her handle the debt ledgers at 12. The twins grew into their own separate selves, Daniel into farm work, deliberate and unhurried, with a gift for animals that meant the ranch's livestock thrived under his care. Ruth into language, talking her way through the world with a fluency that got her hired at the Mill Haven newspaper at 17 as a copy editor, which she treated as a starting position rather than a destination. Thomas, quiet Thomas, who had drawn the house before it existed, he became the one who built the extension. At 16, working with Brennan's sons and a carpenter from town, he oversaw the addition of the dormitory wing he'd drawn as a 7-year-old on 2 sheets of paper. He wasn't sentimental about it. He looked at the finished structure, checked the angles, and said it would hold, and went in for supper. May grew up laughing. That was the simple version. She had the frontier in her, the same as the others, the hardness that the country gives you free of charge. But she wore it lightly in a way none of the others quite managed, and she had the habit, lifelong, ineradicable, of saying come back to anyone who left the house for any reason, as if the words themselves were a kind of insurance. People came through the Ridge House the way Talbot's carriage had once come through the gate. Not always welcome, not always easy, but arriving because they had somewhere to arrive. Women mostly, and children in the first years. Later, anyone the valley sent. A man who'd lost his land to a bad harvest. A family from further east who'd misread the frontier entirely and needed to recalibrate before they tried again. 2 brothers who worked for a season in exchange for shelter and stayed for 3 years and left eventually to start their own operation 20 miles south, sending back a portion of their first good cattle sale without being asked. Clara kept the accounts. She kept them the way she kept everything, practically, without sentimentality, with an eye for what was sustainable rather than what was ideal. She made mistakes, She'd be the first to tell you. A supply arrangement that fell through at the wrong time one winter, putting everyone short for 3 weeks. A decision about the cattle that Eli disagreed with and turned out to be wrong, which she acknowledged plainly, and which Eli received without gloating because he wasn't built for gloating. A year when the accounts went red and stayed there for 4 months, and she sat with it and found the way through it and added it to the internal ledger of things she'd survived. She never married. People assumed things about that over the years. That she was waiting, that she was grieving something, that she'd had opportunities and declined them. The truth was simpler. She'd come west to find a place to belong, and the belonging had turned out not to require the things she'd thought it would. What she'd needed wasn't a husband. It was work that mattered, and people who needed the particular things she had to give, and those she had in such abundance that adding anything more would have been crowding. Voss came back twice a year for the first several years, then once a year, then for a while not at all. And then one spring he appeared at the gate on a different horse and older in the face and said he'd retired and was thinking of settling in the valley. He asked if she knew of any opportunities. She showed him the account books, which needed more legal attention than she'd been able to give them. He looked at the books, then at the Ridge House, then at Clara, and said that seemed reasonable. He took a room in Red Hollow and rode out twice a week and stayed for supper when invited and became, over time, the thing that unambiguous people become to each other when they've been through something real together. Not family exactly, but something that functions similarly and requires less explanation. Talbot's operation contracted steadily over the decade that followed, not from any single cause, but from the accumulated weight of a man who'd built his holdings on the assumption that smaller operations wouldn't survive and had been wrong. When he died, in his own bed, old, which was more than he deserved and less than he'd wanted, probably, the valley didn't mourn publicly and didn't celebrate publicly either, which was its own verdict. Galt simply disappeared from the territory. People do that sometimes. Hector Blaine died at 73, in the spring, at the mill, watching the water wheel, which was where he would have chosen to go, and Clara thought he probably knew it. Mrs. Sato outlived everyone's expectations, including her own, and at 81 was still producing eggs at a rate that continued to embarrass the Mercer hens. Clara grew old at the ridge the way the ridge itself aged, slowly, visibly, without apology. Her hair went gray and then white. Her hands got the look of hands that had done things, which she considered a reasonable record. She walked with a slight stiffness in the left side from an old injury. The fence work, that first day she'd pulled something she'd never quite addressed, and she slept well, which she considered one of the better outcomes of a life lived with enough physical labor to make the body ready for rest each night. She didn't keep a journal. She thought about it once and decided she didn't need to write it down to know what had happened. It was in the house, in the level roof, in the dormitory wing Thomas had built, in the account books Harriet had organized, in the window that kept out the wind, in the gate on the south field that finally worked correctly. It was in the people who passed through and the ones who stayed and the difference the place had made to both kinds. June stayed. That was the simple version of June's life, and the complex one too. She could have left. There were reasons to, at different points, different versions of a life that would have been valid. She stayed because the ridge was hers in the way that things are yours, not because of inheritance, but because you chose them when choosing was hard, and kept choosing them. And that kind of ownership goes too deep to walk away from easily. She managed the Ridge House alongside Clara with the blunt efficiency she'd always had, which had mellowed over the years into something more like authority, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She knew every person who passed through. She remembered their names, the specific circumstances that had brought them, what they'd needed, and what they'd taken with them when they left. She had her father's memory for the land and her own particular gift for seeing people clearly without requiring them to be better than they were. She was 34 when Clara first realized that June was no longer someone she was responsible for. Maybe she'd never been, exactly. Maybe it had always been more mutual than that. Two people staying in a place together, each making the other's staying possible in different ways. The realization didn't change anything. It just named something that had been true for a long time. In Clara's last years, when the stiffness had become more general and the winters required more management and she moved through the house with the careful deliberateness of someone respecting the limits they'd earned, June was simply there. Not hovering, not managing, just present in the way that people are present when they've decided someone matters to them and acted on that decision so consistently for so long that it has become structural, like a load-bearing wall. The last good evening was in early autumn, which was the best time in the valley. The heat finally honest about leaving, the light warm and low, the ridge holding its green longer than the flatland below. They sat on the porch, the two of them, where they'd sat 20 years before when June had talked about the life she'd been planning to leave for. May was inside somewhere, and the sound of her talking to someone, a family that had arrived 2 days prior from further east, finding their way toward something not yet determined, came through the window with the same comfortable weight as always. Clara could feel the evening in her bones the way old people feel things. Not painfully, but fully, with a kind of completeness. The ridge was going purple against the sky. The spring up there was running, the way it always ran. "June," she said. "I'm glad Eli didn't listen to you." June was quiet for a moment. "What?" "When he came to get me, you told him not to." Clara looked at the ridge. "I'm glad he didn't listen." June was quiet for a longer moment. The light moved across the porch the way light moves in that hour, slowly, like it's trying to stay. "Me too," June said. Her voice was its usual composed self, but something in it was not, quite. Something in it had the same quality as that almost laugh from 20 years ago, except this time it had gone all the way through. "He was always better at knowing what we needed than I was." "You both were," Clara said. "You knew it too. You just needed someone else to go first." June didn't answer that. She looked at the ridge the way she'd always looked at it, directly, without softening. The ridge looked back the same way. After a while, May came to the doorway. "You two want supper?" "In a minute," June said. May looked at them both. The two of them on the porch in the last light, and did what she always did, accepted the answer without argument, and went back inside to help with whatever needed doing, saying something to the family inside that made one of their children laugh, a sound that came out through the window and into the evening air and disappeared toward the ridge. Clara closed her eyes. She could feel the porch boards under the chair. The air had a smell that was always exactly itself here, grass and cold water and the particular kind of earth that held a spring year-round. She thought about staying, about what it actually meant, stripped of everything people tried to make it into, the heroism, the sentimentality, the narrative convenience, what it actually was. It was this, a porch at the end of the day, a person beside you who'd also chosen to stay and had gone on choosing it until the choosing became something else entirely, not a decision anymore, but a definition. It was the house still standing behind them, the roof that held, the gate that worked, the accounts that added up. It was May saying, "Come back to everyone who left," as if the words could make it true. It was Eli at 18, signing papers with his name, putting the document in his shirt pocket. It was Thomas at 7, drawing the house as it could be before he knew if any of it would survive. It was June, beside her now, not saying anything, not needing to. The bravest thing, Clara thought, was not the fight. The fight had been necessary, but it wasn't the thing. The bravest thing was every ordinary morning when leaving would have been easier and she'd gotten up and started the day anyway. Hundreds of them. Ordinary, unremarkable, one after another. That was what built something. Not the dramatic moments, not the confrontations and the papers and the lawyers and the county seats. Those were the tests. The building was the days in between. The light finished leaving the ridge. June's hand found hers on the arm of the chair. Not dramatically, just there. The way she did most things. With complete matter-of-factness, as if it had always been the plan. They sat like that while the dark came in and the stars arrived in the way they always did out here,